All right, good morning. Good morning. I am very excited to introduce today, really privileged, Shelly, to have you with us. I will spotlight Shelly for us in just a moment, but Shelly Cline is on. You probably see her there. And Shelly is the historian and director of education for the Midwest Center for Holocaust Remembrance. I didn't say it exactly right. Say it for me, the title of the location there in Overland Park.
The Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. It's a
Okay,
mouthful.
close. It is.
Yeah.
But I loved when I was reading a little bit about you. Historian Shelley has actually a PhD from about 10 or so years ago from the University of Kansas. And she's a lecturer at the University of Kansas, and I'm sure other places around the area with lots of courses I saw that she's put together, trained, and taught in things like anti-Semitism and the West. I saw one where you taught about European culture and society from 1945 forward. Very interesting. Hitler, Nazi Germany, women in war, which I thought with
Mm.
that perspective, as a woman, but just in general, that different perspective. So we are very delighted to have you with us. And so I'm going to spotlight you and turn it over to you. So Shelley, teach us, share with us whatever is on your heart and mind today.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for having me and for all the work that you do. And yeah, again, for highlighting some of those classes that I did years ago. The anti-Semitism class I created when I was an undergrad, or not undergrad, when I was a graduate student at KU. And there was not a class on anti-Semitism. I had the really interesting opportunity to pitch a class to my department, which at the time was Humanities and Western Civ. And the one that I picked was, anti-Semitism in the West, because I think that, as I shared with you last time, the history of anti-Semitism is one that is so adaptable, and that's what makes it so dangerous, is that it continues to change and evolve over time, especially relating to whatever is the current discourse in our world. So, when it was religion that dominated in the uh, you know, Middle Ages, then everything was very, rooted in Christian anti-Semitism. When it switched to, when we saw the rise of economics, then we saw roots of economic anti-Semitism. And then when racism became a thing, then we saw it rooted in racism. So that's what makes it so, yeah, very dangerous, is how adaptable it is. And so I think last time I was here, I really shared a lot of some of those timeless tropes that started, you know, centuries ago, and we see them repurposed today throughout the world, maybe from different sources, but the messaging is still the same. And so a lot of the work that MCHE does is focused on teaching people about that anti-Semitism. So for me, it was something I was interested in from years ago, and then when I started working at MCHE, there was a need for it. And certainly, since October 7th, that need has only increased. And I will say that on one hand, it is, obviously very troubling and scary that anti-Semitism is on the rise in the way that it is. But I will say, if we're thinking about a glimmer of hope, it's that we have the request for education about anti-Semitism that we receive is, it's probably the most requested topic that we've had since October 7th. And the fact that, groups like yours have asked me, last time and this time to come and speak are really a testament to that. So that's something that Jessica, our executive director, and I, we often like to tell people that in the midst of all of this darkness and the stuff that's really frightening, we have been really heartened by the number of non-Jewish groups that have reached out to us, that have invited us to, their prayer groups, their church groups, their community groups, because they want to know. Not only do they want to know and understand for themselves, but they want to know what they can do, and know how to better recognize anti-Semitism when they see it. And so I think that's something I know you guys are all such, strong advocates, but think about, these small moments in your everyday world when you might see something, right? Being able to see it and name it, and engage in those discussions with people, to say, oh, I think this is actually a repurposing of this thing, and it might be really dangerous. I'm shocked how many times people have inadvertently passed on anti-Semitic material, or a comment. And once you tell them no, they're usually pretty good about it. Now, obviously, There are the ones that are hardcore out there. Thankfully, I don't really interact with them. But the fact that some of this language has become so pervasive in our own world is, shows the need that we all need to be having those casual conversations and just stop people when we can. Another thing I wanted to just sort of mention too, or thinking about um, topics for me to speak on, um, is how October 7th and the time since has impacted survivors. We have a survivor community in Kansas City. It's about 75, 80 people today, so smaller than it used to be. But certainly, we interact with them a fair amount. And in the Kansas City area, I don't know how well this will translate to all of you across the world, but in Kansas City, we say our survivor community really loves three things. They love their families, they love Harry Truman, because he's the president who liberated them, right? And he also is here in Kansas City. Uh, and they love Israel. And so for survivors, Israel really represented this safe space that they weren't given in the 30s and 40s. And it was this sense of security that if their neighbors and friends and countries failed them again, there would always be this safe place of Israel. And October 7th and the ensuing anti-Semitism that followed really took that sense of security away from them. And so that's something that we, in our conversations with them, we think about and we see, again, their kind of unease and fear in many ways as well. But again, and we not that it helps in a grand sort of existential level, but like I said, we do try and tell them how much of our community is so invested in learning about anti-Semitism and how to prevent it. Another kind of interesting moment for us in terms of how Holocaust history kind of intersected with October 7th, when actually the week following October 7th, Jessica and myself were leading an MCHE European study trip in throughout various European countries to see Holocaust sites, and among our group were several children of survivors. And we were actually in Prague on the 13th of October, which was, as I'm sure you know, the Day of Rage. And we had been invited to a Shabbat dinner. And so we went to the Shabbat dinner. It was a very international situation. There were people from, other people from the US, there were people from Europe, and there was a young man from Israel who was studying at the medical school in Prague. And he told us that that day, his professors, the school had told him he didn't have to attend class because if he was, if he didn't feel safe, he didn't have to go to class. And he told us that his grandfather had been in Sobibor, one of the death camps. And remarkably, he was one of the 300 individuals who was a part of that uprising. And he was one of the 50 individuals that managed to survive the war from Sobibor. And he stood there on the stage and told us if his grandfather could do what he did and take part in that uprising in Sobibor, then he could go to class that day. And it was such a powerful moment of strength and bravery, but also just this really powerful connection to the Holocaust past that we were there to study, and yet it was very dramatically brought into our present in that way. So certainly these are things that we're thinking about and teaching, and we're just trying to provide information and support for everyone we can that has questions about these things, and trying to push people to be thoughtful about their words, more compassionate in their everyday lives. I think that, we often see anti-Semitism expressed along with a lot of other forms of hatred. And I do worry about this growing kind of culture of meanness that we're in this moment. And so sometimes I guess it sounds a little bit trite to say like, oh, just be nice to people. But I think that when we're all on edge and scared, just a small amount of, grace with someone or kindness can go a long way to maybe stopping an incident that could eventually result in violent expression. So I'm just trying to be mindful of those things in my personal life. Um, how do I do this history work? How do I do what I can in my everyday as well. So, again, a little less history this time, but certainly, I mean, I know I've got a few minutes remaining, but if anyone has questions, or about our work or how, things that we're seeing, I'd really, um, I'd be happy to answer that.
Yeah, just one second. I don't think you just did the screen share, did you? I think maybe somebody else did. That wasn't associate or someone with you, was it?
No.
No. Okay, good. We had a screen share pop up. I'm like, okay, wait. All right. Thanks for taking that down, friend, whoever that was. So yeah, I'm just gonna highlight a couple things. What I'm really fascinated about with you, Shelly, and I'm gonna add my spotlight so you don't feel like you're all alone while I'm talking at you or something like that. Let's see if we got that. One of the things that I love is that you are a scholar. Like you have devoted your life to the study of history. And I don't know if anybody watched. I know some did actually, but I had the really the I don't know if I'd say pleasure, but the blessing of being able to watch the presentation last week about Auschwitz. I mean, I've been engaged in studying for years on these topics. I didn't know any of that. And so to have your scholarship and yet was such a blessing. And I'm sure, can that be, I don't know if you could put, do you have a link to that? If you want to put that in the chat,
Yeah,
people
let
that,
me grab that. I can definitely do
yeah,
that. We,
please
we post
do.
all of our stuff on our YouTube
Yeah,
channel, but
super.
I'll just grab that right now.
Super. Anything you want to put in there. But one of the things I'm noticing, I love that you've taken this scholarly, I call you a brainiac, I'm sure others would think that too, but you've taken it and you're using it in a very practical and personal way and compassion. And I thought that was awesome. I read, actually, I'll just share this with the group. I read the mission of the Midwest Center is to teach the history of the Holocaust, applying its lessons to counter indifference, intolerance, and genocide. And we see you doing that as you're helping us grow in our understanding. So thanks. I see Shelly just highlighted that for us. And there are several people popping on to say, I watched it. I watched it. I was there too. I want to just read, I'm just going to read the chat and see if there's a question. That there are moments or conversations where someone is inadvertently passing on anti-Semitic ideas, and that we should shine the truth into that. And that's actually something I noted in my notes as you were speaking, and I think we're aware of that. Most of us as church members or followers of Jesus. And we didn't even realize maybe we had some of that. We call that replacement theology, which is just an ugly thing. I'm sure you know that. And so we want to be aware. I think of times in my own life when that has happened. And so, and someone shined the light, and I'm like, oh, thank you. So, do you have examples and train us a little bit, and even how to be aware of it? Number one, if it's still in us a little bit, or and things that you've heard or seen passed along that would be a great teaching moment. If you can give us some examples.
Yeah. I mean, a couple examples that we've had that in our work. There was actually a teacher at a local school who had inadvertently, well, she had posted an anti-mask cartoon back during COVID times. But the way the particular, she was just meaning to call attention to the mask mandate, but the particular image happened to it was, as you probably saw during COVID times, there was a lot of equating mask mandates, vaccine mandates with stuff to do with the Holocaust. So
Mhm.
there was a lot of that, which, people wanted to use the Holocaust because it was like, oh, here's a big thing, right? It makes
Right.
it feel important, right? That's why we see a lot of Holocaust like misuse and abuse because it's like you want to really call attention to your thing. So you're like, oh, compare it to the biggest thing in Western history. Um, but once this woman was not anti-Semitic, and when we had a conversation with her and said, "Do you realize that the way this is put together, this is actually anti-Semitic?" She was
Mhm.
horrified that she had done it, and she was sorry. And she then went on not only to like personally reflect, she then told her students regularly, this happened to me, and you think about what you post and you might not understand, like it may not seem harmful to you, but she really turned it into a teaching moment. And I thought that that was so admirable to be able to own her mistake, because I think that's another thing that we really lack in today's world is being able to say, I'm wrong. It's fine to change your mind. It's wonderful to learn and have a better, more evolved position. That's a great value. And I think we undervalue that today. It's always like, well, I have to have this opinion forever. And if I change my mind, then I guess I'm not serious. But, life is about learning and being the best versions of ourselves and correcting our past mistakes. So, that was one of the best interactions that I've had in this job, was really seeing her take to heart our words, and not only for herself, but then for her students.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
think
She
it's
was
being
well
able to,
highlighted.
yeah, and being able to put our egos aside. Like, oh, I was wrong. And instead of being embarrassed about it, to then use that with other people, like, hey, I got it wrong too once, and that's all right, but you can do better in the future.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I have a thought. I want to share one I've experienced personally, but and maybe you'll think of another example because I think this is probably really helpful. If you have any other, so if anything else comes to mind, but I'm just going to share with the group. I was with two Jewish friends from Israel, and I was hosting them, and they were speaking at a Christian church, a large church in Fort Lauderdale or South Florida. And we left there, and they're both laughing. It's a father and son, and they're laughing, but it's that kind of like uncomfortable laugh. I'm like, what are you guys talking about? Because they made some little comment, and I'm driving the car, and I'm like, no, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, Sarah, don't did you not see what was on the wall? I'm like, what are you talking about? There was this huge mural on this like 2-story wall of a crusader.
Mm,
And even the
hmm
language of talking about crusades and
hmm
what that would say to a Jewish person. So that's
Yeah.
my own example of when I had I've had lots of like, oh my gosh, I'm so clueless. But I don't know if you have any other examples. I think that would maybe
Um,
else come to mind. Just even little things.
yeah. I mean, a common one, and this is, I'm sure, I mean, today it's been mostly weeded out, but people used to use the phrase like Jew 'em down all the
Oh yeah.
time. And when we do, I mean, I'm not saying that we hear this in rural populations, but I came from a small town where that was something that people
Mhm.
said. And a lot of times I use this as example of something that people do because they've done it and they didn't even actually think about what the word meant. Same
Right.
thing with that derogatory phrase, like I got gypped, right?
Yep.
Like people don't know that that's a derogatory term about Roman Sinti people. So, um, again, it's one of those things why history is important. And I think so what's really key in all of this is when you notice it, um, how you approach the person. And that when I used to teach some of my gender literacy classes, we'd talk a lot about calling people in instead of calling people out. Because it really makes a difference how you say, like, oh, hey, did you know, as opposed to immediately kind of condemning them for assuming that they had anti-Semitic intent. Sometimes people do. Um, and I would say, along with that, sometimes it's important to note, is there a trend, right? Is this something that in an individual situation, do you have a friend who often says this stuff? Well, you're going to approach them differently than maybe someone who randomly said it. And I think that goes for our, public figures as well, when we're looking at behaviors of people who are in, the media spotlight. Is this behavior or statement something that's a one-off, or is it something that there is a clear trend? And if there's
Mhm.
a clear trend, and if these are people who are in a public space, then I think we need to be very vocal and firm about saying this isn't okay. This trending belief is not what I want to see in my world, in my country, in my community.
That's good. That's good. And even helping us know how to spot or not just spot it, but how to handle it. Now, Shelly, I know your time is limited. I have a couple questions that have popped up. Do you have a few more minutes? Sure. Okay, great. One is related to how to be supportive of any survivors that we might know or in community. And we have a question for someone that actually lives in Kansas City, but it would apply elsewhere. And she says, what ways would you suggest about how to best support or encourage survivors living in Kansas City or elsewhere?
Jen, we don't, there are agencies in Kansas City like Jewish Family Services. I'm sure those exist in other communities as well. The groups like that provide a lot of like actual assistance to survivors. So like in Kansas City, Jewish Family Services works a lot with our Russian speaking survivors who a lot of them have very limited English. So it provides translation services for them, sometimes transportation to, doctor's appointments or just other events. Um, So I
That's
think
very,
that's a yeah, we don't provide kind of those physical services for them, but again, a group like, Jewish Family Services would. So
Mhm.
if you're in the Kansas City area, they're a good group to check out. If you're in another community, there's probably a similar group that is really looking after, kind of the real like both physical, but then also day-to-day needs of survivors.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm thinking there's probably, if you're in a bigger town where there's a JCC, that they
Mhm.
might be able to direct you to other specific agencies. So that's a great question. Thanks, Liz, for asking. And now, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, one thing that we do is we send them birthday cards and we
Oh,
also send them Rosh Hashanah bags that we deliver to wish them a happy new year. So that is something that like we do on a more like face-to-face physically engaged sort of thing. But we do consider that as like, it's a good morale booster.
that's really good. That's good. Okay, I have one more question. It's a little bit on the political side, which you may or may not want to address. So you can say pass, and that's okay. The question came, how, and I'm not sure I'm reading this right, but I think it is how will the USA's new administration, in your perspective, that more kind of pro-Israel, anti-Semitic, I guess, how will that impact Holocaust remembrance and education, or do you think it will? I hope I
I
got
mean,
that right, Valerie. You can type in if I didn't say it quite right, Val.
I think the impact that we see in terms of like Holocaust remembrance and education in terms of the new administration is more about the signaling of, cuts to DEI and especially with the Defense Intelligence Agency that, in the inclusion of saying no more MLK, Black History Month, Women's History Month, LGBTQ month, Holocaust Remembrance Day was in there as well. And that's something that our center did make a statement about because, um, I don't the lessons of the Holocaust are universal. And as a center, we also stand with all people who've been discriminated against and have a history of discrimination, and we're against trends of new discrimination. So um, I would say, if anything, this is a moment where we are concerned about, Holocaust remembrance, absolutely. But
Mhm.
as you read our mission, this is a moment where we feel very duty bound to lean into that part about the lessons of the Holocaust and, standing up and holding space for other groups that are also being marginalized and have a history of discrimination. But specifically with the Holocaust, yeah, I think it's very troubling that something so established was really, not that these others aren't by any means, but that, yeah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we said in our statement, America is the country that helped defeat the Nazis. We ended Nazi fascism, and along with obviously um, help, we didn't do it alone. But this is a major part of our history, and so for the country who helped end Nazism, it's very distressing to be then told we shouldn't be commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day. Like
Mhm.
that's a troubling turn for America.
Well, and I think that's a great prayer point that maybe, so much has come out so fast, like head spinning, that maybe there'll be some nuance and some, redefinition and defining. And we certainly hope that if and when that happens, that there's a clarity about Holocaust remembrance, because I think it seems the administration is very pro-Israel, very which I would then assume pro-Jewish as well. So let's hope so, right? We'll hope.
Right.
All right. Well, one last question. This is from Mark. Mark is actually a Jewish man, a friend here on the call, who's from Israel. Excuse me, not from Israel, from Canada. But he says, "How do you deal with Nazi symbols that are being applied to Israel in an erroneous fashion?" Hmm.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that we highlight in our teaching a lot is being able to, um, we teach people that you can criticize Israel like any other country, right? It's a nation. You can criticize its politics. You can't question whether it has a right to exist. And so often we see people jump to these, like, again, Nazi comparisons to make a political point. So, um, we spend a lot of time pointing out how those are inappropriate. And again, if you have a legitimate point of criticism of policy, you can make that in a way that isn't anti-Semitic. Um, but we use a lot of, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but Iran did a Holocaust cartoon contest. Several of them were just horrible. And we use a lot of those images because they're so egregious and obvious to read that we use those in our teaching because they're so obviously bad that it helps people identify like, oh, I get it, right? So that's one tactic that we use with them. Um, but yes, anytime you're equating Israel with Nazis, it's a easy call of anti-Semitism.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't want to keep you any longer. There were a little bit more, but we'll hopefully have you back another time, I'm
Sure.
sure. And we're really thankful. Just your perspective, your very helpful hints and tips and things to be aware of personally and with those around us. So thank you so much, Shelley. We really appreciate you, and God bless you. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me again.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.